The morning sun had barely begun to warm the streets of Pine Creek when Nate Taylor flipped the sign on his small repair shop from closed to open. He stifled a yawn as he wiped the sleep from his eyes. At 26, Nate's hands were already calloused and stained with the permanent marks of motor oil that no amount of scrubbing could remove. Those hands told the story of a young man who had been fixing things since he was tall enough to reach his father's toolbox. The repair shop, Taylor's Fix-It, wasn't much to look at. The faded blue paint on the exterior was chipping away, revealing patches of the original brick underneath. Inside, tools hung in meticulous order on pegboards, a system Nate had perfected over the 3 years since he'd opened the place. It wasn't fancy, but it was his, and that thought brought a smile to his tired face each morning. Today marked the 5th straight day Nate had opened the shop without having taken a day off. Business had been slow lately, and the stack of bills on his desk grew taller each week. The rent for both the shop and his tiny apartment above the local laundromat was due in 10 days. The thought made his stomach tighten, but he pushed the worry aside as he fired up the old coffee maker his mother had given him when he first opened the shop. "One day at a time," he mumbled to himself, a phrase his grandfather had repeated like a mantra. The old man had taught Nate everything he knew about fixing engines, appliances, and just about anything with moving parts. Though his grandfather had passed 5 years ago, Nate still found himself having conversations with him in his head, especially when faced with a particularly tricky repair job. The morning dragged on with only 2 customers, Mrs. Whitaker dropping off her ancient toaster that needed rewiring, and a teenager who needed his bike chain fixed before his paper route. The repairs brought in just enough to cover lunch, a ham sandwich from the diner across the street. By late afternoon, Nate had resorted to organizing his toolbox for the 3rd time that week. The bell above the door jingled and he looked up, hoping for another customer. It was just Ray, the mailman, with another handful of envelopes that undoubtedly contained more bills. "Slow day?" Ray asked, handing over the mail. "You could say that," Nate replied with a forced smile. "How's your route today?" "Almost done. Then home to put my feet up and watch the game." Ray glanced around the empty shop. "Don't work too hard, kid." After Ray left, Nate flipped through the mail, electricity bill, supplier invoice, and a flyer advertising low-interest loans for small businesses that he knew he wouldn't qualify for with his credit score. He shoved them into the drawer with the others and checked his watch. It was nearly 6 o'clock, time to close up shop. Just as he was about to flip the sign to closed, he spotted an elderly man across the street, struggling with a wheelchair outside Maggie's diner. The old man wore a faded gray sweater despite the warm spring day and had a newsboy cap pulled low over his forehead. The wheelchair seemed to be stuck, one wheel refusing to turn as the man tried to push it forward. Nate hesitated for just a moment. He was exhausted, hungry, and the thought of his bed upstairs was incredibly tempting, but something about the old man's determined yet frustrated expression reminded him of his grandfather. With a sigh, Nate locked the shop door and jogged across the street. "Excuse me, sir. Need some help with that?" Nate called as he approached. The old man looked up, his weathered face creasing into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Those eyes were a striking blue, sharp and alert despite his apparent age, which Nate guessed to be somewhere in his 80s. "Oh, I don't want to trouble you, young man," the elderly man said, his voice surprisingly strong. "This old chair's been giving me problems all week. Think it's finally given up the ghost?" Nate crouched down to examine the wheelchair. The right wheel was jammed, and upon closer inspection, he could see that a bearing had completely worn out. The chair itself was well used but had once been a quality model. Now it showed years of wear and makeshift repairs. "I run the repair shop across the street," Nate said, pointing over his shoulder with his thumb. "I could take a look if you'd like." "No charge," he added quickly, noting the man's shabby appearance. The old man raised his eyebrows. "No charge? That's not how businesses stay afloat, son." Nate shrugged. "Consider it my good deed for the day. I'm Nate, by the way. Nate Taylor." "Henry," the old man replied simply, offering a hand that was surprisingly firm in its grip. "Henry Winters. And I'd be mighty grateful for the help if you're sure." "I'm sure." Nate stood up. "Do you have another way to get around while I work on this? It might take a day or so to get the parts." Henry tapped a wooden cane that had been hooked over the arm of the wheelchair. "I can manage with this for short distances." Got a bad hip, not totally useless yet. He winked, and Nate couldn't help but smile. Let me help you home first, and then I'll take the chair to my shop. No need, Henry insisted. I live just up the block at the Sunset Apartments. I can make it fine with my cane. You take the chair and work your magic. Nate nodded, surprised at the old man's independence. The Sunset Apartments weren't exactly luxury living. They were small, affordable units mostly occupied by retirees on fixed incomes and young couples just starting out. All right then. I'll let you know when it's ready. Is there a number where I can reach you? Henry patted his pocket and pulled out an outdated flip phone. Got this old thing. Never much cared for those fancy smartphones everyone's glued to these days. He recited his number, which Nate saved in his phone. As Nate wheeled the chair across the street to his shop, he couldn't help but wonder about Henry. There was something in the way he spoke, the way he carried himself despite his physical limitations, that suggested he hadn't always lived such a modest life. But Pine Creek was a small town, and Nate had never seen him before today. Back in his shop, Nate flipped on the extra lights and examined the wheelchair more thoroughly. The bearing was shot, as he'd suspected, but there were other issues too. The frame needed reinforcement at several stress points. The upholstery was worn thin, and the braking system needed adjustment. It would take more than a simple fix to make this chair reliable again. Nate glanced at the clock, almost 7 now. His stomach growled, reminding him that the ham sandwich had been hours ago. He should call it a day, grab some dinner, and tackle the wheelchair tomorrow. But something pushed him to continue working. Maybe it was the memory of his grandfather, or perhaps it was just the knowledge that Henry needed his chair. He pulled out his phone and ordered a pizza for delivery, then got to work dismantling the problematic wheel. As he worked, he found himself wondering about Henry's life. Did he have family nearby? How long had he been using this wheelchair? The chair told its own story. It had been well maintained at some point, but had fallen into disrepair more recently, as if its owner could no longer afford proper maintenance. By the time the pizza arrived, Nate had the wheel completely disassembled and had made a list of parts he would need to order. As he ate a slice of pepperoni pizza with one hand and sketched out some improvement ideas with the other, he realized he was enjoying himself more than he had in weeks. The simple wheelchair repair had sparked something in him, the pure joy of fixing something that mattered to someone else. It wasn't about money or keeping his business afloat. It was about using his skills to make a difference, however small. Nate worked late into the night, cleaning each part of the wheelchair meticulously, oiling what could be salvaged and listing what needed replacement. He found himself adding extras to his repair plan: a cushion for better support, smoother rolling casters for the front wheels, a pocket on the side for Henry to store his cane. When he finally dragged himself upstairs to his apartment at midnight, exhaustion had settled deep in his bones, but a sense of purpose had taken root as well. Tomorrow he'd call his supplier first thing and put a rush on the parts, even if it meant paying extra. He'd use the last of his emergency fund if necessary. As Nate drifted off to sleep, he thought about Henry's striking blue eyes and the dignity with which he carried himself. There was a story there, one Nate found himself curious to learn. What he didn't know, couldn't possibly know, was that helping Henry Winters would set in motion a chain of events that would change the course of his life forever. And somewhere across town, in an apartment far more modest than anyone would expect, Henry Winters sat in an armchair looking out at the twinkling lights of Pine Creek, thinking about the young man who had offered to fix his wheelchair without a second thought, expecting nothing in return. A small smile played on his lips as he made a phone call to an unlisted number. I think I might have found him, Henry said quietly into the phone. Yes, right here in Pine Creek. We'll see what tomorrow brings. The early morning light streamed through the windows of Taylor's Fix-It shop as Nate made his third call to the medical supply company. He'd been on hold for 20 minutes, and the tinny music playing through his phone speaker was testing his patience. Yes, I understand these are specialty parts, he said when someone finally answered. But I have a customer who really needs his chair. Is there any way to expedite the shipping? Nate listened to the response, trying not to let his disappointment show in his voice. 3 days is the fastest you can do. All right, I'll take it. After hanging up, Nate rubbed his eyes and took a long sip of coffee. He'd slept poorly, his mind racing with ideas for improving Henry's wheelchair. While waiting for parts, he could at least begin work on the frame and clean up the existing components. The shop door opened and Nate looked up, expecting to see Mrs. Whitaker coming to check on her toaster. Instead, Henry hobbled in, leaning heavily on his wooden cane. "Morning, young man," Henry greeted with a nod. "Hope you don't mind me stopping by. Thought I'd check on my chariot." Nate hurried over to help, but Henry waved him off. "I'm not made of glass, son. Just moves a bit slower these days." "I've ordered the parts for your chair," Nate explained, guiding Henry to the shop's only customer chair, a padded folding chair he'd rescued from a yard sale. "They should be here in 3 days." "I'm sorry it can't be sooner." Henry settled into the chair with a grateful sigh. "No rush, I've been making do with this cane for years before I got the wheelchair. Doctor finally insisted I use the chair for longer distances." He looked around the shop with interest. "Nice place you've got here. Been in business long?" 3 years on my own," Nate replied, returning to the wheelchair frame he'd been cleaning. "But I've been fixing things since I was a kid. My grandfather taught me everything I know." "Smart man, your grandfather," Henry observed. "Not many people these days understand the value of fixing things instead of replacing them." He watched as Nate worked, his blue eyes missing nothing. "You're making some improvements to my chair, aren't you? Not just fixing what's broken?" Nate looked up, slightly embarrassed. "Hope you don't mind. I noticed a few things that could work better. I'm adding a cushioned seat, reinforcing the frame where it's stressed, and putting in a pocket on the side for your cane." Henry's eyebrows rose. "All that's not going to be cheap." "Don't worry about the cost," Nate said quickly. "Consider it professional courtesy." "Professional courtesy," Henry repeated with a small smile. "You do that for all your customers?" Nate shrugged, focusing on the bolt he was cleaning. "I try to help where I can." "Even when your own shop is struggling?" Henry asked softly. Nate's hand stilled. He looked up at Henry, surprised. "What makes you think I'm struggling?" Henry gestured around the empty shop. "Not exactly bustling with customers, is it? And that stack of envelopes on your desk has bills written all over them. Trust me, son. I know what it looks like when someone's trying to keep their head above water." For a moment, Nate felt exposed, as if this stranger had peered directly into his worries. Then he sighed. "It's been a tough few months. People don't fix things as much anymore. They buy new. But I'll be all right." He tried to sound more confident than he felt. Henry nodded thoughtfully. "What made you want to open a repair shop anyway? Young fellow like you could probably work for one of those big tech companies, make good money." "Never been much for big companies," Nate replied, returning to his work. "My grandfather always said there's nothing more satisfying than fixing something with your own hands, seeing it work again because of what you did." He smiled at the memory. "He ran this shop for 40 years before he passed. I worked here summers growing up, then full-time after high school. When he died, I took over. A family business," Henry said approvingly. "Those are becoming rare these days." "Your parents weren't interested?" Nate shook his head. "Dad's an accountant in the city. Mom's a teacher. They weren't thrilled when I chose this over college. But they've come around." He didn't mention the arguments, the disappointment in his father's eyes, the frequent suggestions that he could still apply to engineering school. "And you?" Henry pressed. "No regrets about your choice?" Nate thought about it as he worked. The familiar motions of cleaning and reassembling parts soothing in their rhythm. "Some days are harder than others," he admitted. "When the bills pile up, or when I have to turn down a friend's invitation because I can't afford dinner out. But then someone brings in something that means a lot to them and I fix it, and the look on their face." He shrugged. "That's worth something, you know." Henry nodded slowly, as if Nate had confirmed something important. "Yes, I know exactly what that's worth." He eased himself up from the chair. "Well, I won't keep you from your work. Is there a diner nearby where an old man can get a decent cup of coffee?" "Maggie's across the street," Nate replied. "Best pie in town, too. Care to join me?" Henry asked. "My treat. Seems only fair since you're doing so much for my wheelchair." Nate was about to refuse. He had work to do after all. But the genuine invitation in Henry's eyes made him reconsider. There was something about the old man that intrigued him. Plus, he hadn't had a real conversation with anyone other than customers in days. "Sure," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Just let me lock up." At Maggie's, they settled into a booth by the window. The diner was quiet at mid-morning, with just a few regulars at the counter. Maggie herself, a woman in her 50s with a no-nonsense manner and the best baking skills in 3 counties, brought over 2 coffees without being asked. "Morning, Nate," she said. then nodded at Henry. Haven't seen you around before. Henry Winters, he introduced himself with a tip of his newsboy cap. Just passing through your lovely town? Maggie responded, clearly not convinced. Well, any friend of Nate's is welcome here. You boys want breakfast? They ordered pancakes for Nate, who suddenly realized how hungry he was, and eggs with toast for Henry. As they waited for their food, Henry asked Nate about the town, his customers, his life. Unlike most people who ask questions as a prelude to talking about themselves, Henry seemed genuinely interested in Nate's answers. So, no wife? Girlfriend? Henry asked after their food arrived. Nate shook his head, mouth full of pancake. Not right now. Had a girlfriend until about 6 months ago. Lily. She moved to Chicago for a job. You didn't consider going with her? The shop is here, Nate said simply, as if that explained everything. And in a way it did. The shop was his grandfather's legacy, his own dream, his responsibility. He couldn't just walk away from it. And what about you? Nate asked, turning the conversation away from himself. You said you're passing through. Where are you headed? Henry took a slow sip of coffee before answering. Nowhere in particular. Spent most of my life rushing from one place to another. Now I take my time, see what there is to see. Sounds nice, Nate said. Traveling around, no schedule. It has its moments, Henry agreed. Though I find I miss having a place to call home. He gazed out the window at the small town street, the familiar shops, the neighbors greeting each other as they passed. A community. There was something wistful in his tone that made Nate wonder about Henry's story. The old man dressed simply, lived in a modest apartment, yet spoke with the confidence and insight of someone who had seen much more of the world than Pine Creek. Well, you're welcome in Pine Creek as long as you like, Nate said. We're a friendly bunch mostly. I can see that, Henry replied, his eyes twinkling. Not every town has young men who drop everything to fix an old man's wheelchair. Nate felt his face warm. Anyone would have done the same. No, Henry said firmly. They wouldn't. That's what makes it special, Nate. He glanced at his watch. I should let you get back to your shop. Thank you for the company. As they were leaving the diner, Nate noticed Henry reach for his wallet and come up short. Must have left it at the apartment, Henry muttered, looking embarrassed. Don't worry about it, Nate said quickly, paying the bill before Henry could protest. You can get the next one. Outside they parted ways, with Henry insisting he could make it back to his apartment without help. Nate watched him go, the old man moving slowly but determinedly down the sidewalk, acknowledging greetings from passers-by with a dignified nod. Back at the shop, Nate found himself working with renewed energy. He spent the afternoon reinforcing the wheelchair frame, preparing it for the new parts. As he worked, he thought about Henry, his sharp eyes, his thoughtful questions, the way he seemed to understand Nate's struggles without judgment. By closing time, Nate had accomplished more than he expected. He was locking up when his phone rang, an unknown number. Hello? Mr. Taylor? This is Parkview Hospital. We have a patient here, Henry Winters. He's had a fall and asked us to call you. Nate's heart sank. Is he all right? He's stable, but he's asking to see you. Are you able to come down? I'm on my way, Nate said, already reaching for his keys. The fluorescent lights of Parkview Hospital cast a harsh glow over the waiting room. Nate tapped his foot nervously as he waited for news about Henry. When he'd arrived 20 minutes ago, the nurse at the front desk had told him the doctor was still examining Henry and asked him to wait. Nate glanced around at the other people in the waiting room. A mother trying to soothe a fussy toddler, an elderly couple holding hands, a teenager with a basketball under his arm and a worried expression, everyone waiting for news about someone they cared about. It struck Nate as odd that he was here waiting for a man he'd only met yesterday, yet somehow felt responsible for. Mr. Taylor? Nate looked up to see a nurse standing at the entrance to the waiting room. He stood quickly. Yes, that's me. How's Henry? He's doing fine. Just some bruising from the fall. Thankfully, nothing broken. He's asking for you. The nurse, whose name tag read Grace, led Nate through the double doors and down a corridor. He's lucky he didn't hit his head when he fell. At his age, that could have been serious. Do you know how it happened? Nate asked. Apparently, he was trying to reach something on a high shelf in his apartment. His cane slipped. Grace shook her head. Stubborn old men, they never ask for help. She stopped outside a room and knocked lightly before opening the door. Mr. Winters? Your friend is here. Henry was sitting up in bed looking smaller somehow in the standard-issue hospital gown. A bruise was forming on his left cheek and his arm was wrapped in a temporary bandage. Despite this, his blue eyes lit up when he saw Nate. "There he is," Henry said. "Sorry to drag you all the way over here, son." "It's no trouble," Nate said, stepping into the room as Grace left. "What happened?" The nurse said. "You fell?" Henry waved his good hand dismissively. "Just being a fool. Tried to reach a book on the top shelf instead of using that grabber thing the home health nurse left me." He grimaced. Pride comes before a fall, literally in my case. Nate pulled a chair up to the bedside. "You had me worried. They're letting you go home today?" "That's the plan. Doctor wants to run one more test to be sure I didn't knock anything loose in this old noggin." Henry tapped his temple. "But I don't have a way to get home. That's why I called you. Hate to impose, but..." "It's not an imposition," Nate interrupted. "Of course I'll take you home." Relief washed over Henry's face. "Thank you. They took my wallet and phone for safekeeping when they admitted me. Should get them back soon." A thought occurred to Nate. "Do you have someone I should call? Family or friends who'd want to know you're in the hospital?" A shadow passed over Henry's face. "No one local. My wife passed 10 years ago. My son..." He paused, a complicated emotion flickering across his features. "Well, he's very busy with his own life." The way Henry said it made Nate suspect there was more to that story, but he didn't press. "I understand. My parents live just a couple hours away, but sometimes it feels like we're in different worlds." "That happens," Henry said softly. "Life pulls people in different directions." He seemed about to say more when a doctor entered the room. "Mr. Winters, good news. Your scans look clear. No sign of concussion or internal injuries. You're free to go home, but I'd like you to take it easy for a few days." The doctor, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, handed Henry a sheet of paper. "Instructions for wound care." "Any questions?" "Just one," Henry replied. "When can I ditch this wrap on my arm?" "It's just a scrape. Keep it covered for 24 hours, then you can switch to a regular bandage. Change it daily until the wound closes." She turned to Nate. "Are you the one taking him home?" Nate nodded. "Good. Make sure he rests. No climbing or reaching for things on high shelves." She gave Henry a pointed look, which he returned with an innocent smile. After the doctor left, a nurse brought in Henry's personal belongings and helped him get dressed. Nate waited outside, then helped Henry into a wheelchair for the trip to the hospital exit. Hospital policy for all discharged patients. "Not as comfortable as the one you're fixing up for me," Henry commented as they wheeled down the corridor. "Speaking of which, the parts should arrive tomorrow," Nate said. "I should have it ready for you by the weekend." At the hospital entrance, Nate helped Henry into his old pickup truck. The vehicle had seen better days, much like Henry's wheelchair, but Nate kept the engine in perfect running condition even as the exterior rusted and faded. "Sorry about the mess," Nate apologized, clearing some tool catalogs and an empty coffee cup from the passenger seat. "Don't get many passengers. No apology needed. I've ridden in everything from ox carts to private jets in my time." Henry settled himself carefully, wincing a little as his bruised body protested the movement. Nate raised an eyebrow as he started the truck. "Private jets? You've had quite a life, Henry." The old man's eyes twinkled. "More than you might guess." The drive to the Sunset Apartments took only a few minutes. The building was a 3-story brick structure, plain but well-maintained. Nate helped Henry up to his second-floor apartment, taking most of the old man's weight as they climbed the stairs. "You should get some rest," Nate said as Henry unlocked his door. "Do you need anything?" "Food, medicine? I think I'm set for now," Henry replied, then hesitated. "Though if you have time, I wouldn't mind some company for a bit. Gets quiet here sometimes." Nate checked his watch. The shop was closed for the day anyway. "Sure, I can stay." As Henry opened the door and flipped on the lights, Nate was surprised by what he saw. He'd expected an apartment that matched Henry's simple clothing and apparent financial situation. Basic furniture, maybe some outdated appliances. Instead, the space was tastefully furnished with what looked like handcrafted pieces. Bookshelves lined one wall filled with well-worn volumes. A few framed photographs sat on a sideboard, and a plush armchair faced a window with a view of the town square. "Nice place," Nate said, following Henry inside. "It suits my needs," Henry replied. He moved slowly to the kitchen area, which was open to the living room. "Can I offer you something to drink?" Water, coffee? I might have some juice? Water's fine, Nate said, stopping Henry with a gentle hand on his arm. I'll get it. You should sit down. Henry started to protest, then seemed to think better of it. He nodded and made his way to the armchair by the window. Nate found glasses in a cabinet and filled 2 with water from a filtered pitcher in the refrigerator. As he handed one to Henry, Nate's attention was caught by one of the photographs on the sideboard. It showed a much younger Henry in what appeared to be a boardroom, shaking hands with a group of men in business suits. Behind them was a large logo, Winters International. Is this you? Nate asked, picking up the frame. Henry glanced over. Yes. From another lifetime, it seems. Winters International, Nate read. Like your last name. Were you? I was in business, yes, Henry said simply. That photo was taken when we expanded into Asian markets sometime in the 80s. He sipped his water. Seems like 100 years ago now. Nate looked at the other photos. Henry with a beautiful woman who must have been his wife. Henry receiving some kind of award. Henry with a young man who shared his striking blue eyes but not his warm expression. The younger man stood stiffly in an expensive suit, looking impatient to be elsewhere. Your son? Nate asked, gesturing to the photo. Henry nodded. Thomas. He runs the company now. There was pride in his voice, but also something else, regret perhaps. Nate set the photo back carefully. So you weren't just in business. You owned the company? Winters International? Henry met his gaze steadily. I did. Still hold a significant stake, though I stepped back from day-to-day operations years ago. Nate's mind raced. He'd never heard of Winters International, but the photo suggested it was substantial. Why was a business owner, possibly a wealthy one, living in a modest apartment in Pine Creek using a beaten-up wheelchair, wearing second-hand clothes? As if reading his thoughts, Henry smiled. You're wondering why I live like this when I could afford better. Nate felt his face flush. It's none of my business. Maybe not, but it's a fair question. Henry gestured for Nate to sit on the sofa across from him. The truth is, I grew tired of the life that came with wealth. The endless meetings, the false friends, the constant pressure to acquire more. He looked out the window at the small town square, where children were playing under the watchful eyes of parents. When my wife died, I realized I'd spent decades building something that didn't make me happy. So I simplified. You gave up being rich to live here? Nate asked, disbelieving. Henry chuckled. I didn't give up being rich, son. I gave up flaunting it. There's a difference. My money is still there, still working in the world through the company and my foundation. I just choose not to surround myself with it. Nate tried to process this information. The humble old man he'd helped with a broken wheelchair was actually some kind of retired business magnate. It seemed unbelievable, yet the photographs provided evidence. Why Pine Creek? Nate asked. Of all the places you could have chosen? Pure chance, Henry admitted. I was traveling through, my car broke down, and while it was being repaired, I walked around town. People nodded hello on the street. A child helped me pick up some papers I dropped. The server at the diner remembered my order when I came back a second time. He shrugged. It felt real in a way my life hadn't for a long time. And the wheelchair? The apartment? Nate pressed. That's all part of simplifying? The wheelchair I genuinely need. Old skiing injury that never healed right. But yes, I choose to live modestly. It helps me see people as they really are. Henry's gaze was direct. When people know you have money, they treat you differently. They want things from you. They show you their best face, not their true one. Nate thought about how he'd rushed to help Henry, offered to fix his wheelchair for free, brought him home from the hospital, all without knowing who he really was. Would he be done the same if he'd known Henry was wealthy? He liked to think so, but couldn't be entirely sure. So almost no one here knows who you really are, Nate said. It wasn't a question. And I'd prefer to keep it that way, Henry replied, his tone gentle but firm. I value my privacy and the normal life I've built here. Nate nodded slowly. I won't say anything. Thank you. Relief crossed Henry's features. It's nice, actually, to have someone know. Gets lonely sometimes, keeping parts of yourself hidden. An unexpected feeling of protectiveness came over Nate. This man had entrusted him with a secret, made himself vulnerable. Your secret's safe with me. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Henry asked about the shop, and the conversation turned to everyday matters. By the time Nate left an hour later with a promise to check on Henry the next day, it felt as if they'd known each other for years rather than days. As Nate drove home, his mind kept returning to the revelations of the afternoon. Henry Winters, apparently a successful businessman, possibly even wealthy, was living a deliberately simplified life in Pine Creek. And of all the people in town, he'd chosen to confide in Nate. It didn't make sense. Yet at the same time, it explained the dignity with which Henry carried himself, the wisdom in his eyes that spoke of a life fully lived, the insights he offered that seemed beyond what one might expect from an ordinary retiree. Parking outside his small apartment above the laundromat, Nate couldn't help comparing his humble living situation with what Henry had chosen. The difference was, Henry could return to luxury anytime he wanted. Nate was struggling just to keep his grandfather's shop alive. He pushed the thought away as he climbed the stairs to his apartment. Henry's revelation didn't change anything. The wheelchair still needed fixing. The bills still needed paying. Life went on, but as Nate fell asleep that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had shifted in his world, as if a door had opened, revealing possibilities he hadn't known existed. The parts for Henry's wheelchair arrived 3 days later, delivered by a courier who seemed annoyed at having to find Taylor's fix-it shop in the small town of Pine Creek. Nate signed for the package with barely contained excitement. He'd been checking the tracking information obsessively, eager to complete the repairs for Henry. The past few days had fallen into a comfortable routine. Nate would open the shop, work on whatever repairs came in, and then visit Henry in the afternoon, bringing groceries or just stopping by for a chat. Henry's bruises were healing, the bright purple fading to a dull yellow-green, and he moved with less pain each day. Their conversations ranged from the practical, Henry offering surprising insights into how Nate might expand his repair business, to the philosophical, discussing books they'd both read or sharing stories from their vastly different lives. Despite the gap in their ages and experiences, Nate found in Henry something he hadn't realized he was missing, a mentor, perhaps even a friend. Now, with the parts finally in hand, Nate closed the shop early and threw himself into completing the wheelchair repairs. He installed the new bearings, reinforced the frame where it had been weakening, added the cushioned seat he'd ordered, and attached a custom-made pocket on the side for Henry's cane. By the time evening fell, the wheelchair looked almost new, sturdy, comfortable, and personalized. Nate stood back to admire his work, a sense of satisfaction warming his chest. This wasn't just a repair job. It was a gift for someone who had unexpectedly become important to him. His phone rang, breaking into his thoughts. It was Randy from the bank. Nate's stomach tightened as he answered. "Hey, Randy." "Nate, just calling to check if you've had a chance to reconsider our conversation from last week," Randy said, his voice professionally pleasant but with an undercurrent of finality. Nate ran a hand through his hair. "I'm still working on it. Is there any way I can get an extension on the loan payment? I wish I could help you out, buddy. But you're already 3 months behind." "The bank's policy is clear," Randy sighed. "Look, you've got until the end of the month. After that, we'll have to start formal proceedings." "I understand," Nate said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Thanks for the heads up." After hanging up, Nate sank onto his workbench stool, the satisfaction of completing Henry's wheelchair now overshadowed by the reality of his financial situation. The truth was, Taylor's fix-it shop was failing. Between the rising rent for the shop space, the loan payments for equipment he'd purchased to expand the business last year, and the general decline in repair work as people increasingly opted to replace rather than fix items, Nate was drowning in debt. He'd tried everything, extending his hours, offering mobile repair services, even creating a simple website. Nothing had made enough difference. At this rate, he'd have to close the shop within months, if not weeks. The thought of losing his grandfather's legacy felt like a physical pain. This shop wasn't just a business. It was the connection to the man who had raised him, taught him, believed in him when no one else did, and now Nate was failing him. The bell over the shop door jingled. Nate looked up surprised. He was sure he'd locked up for the day. Henry stood in the doorway, leaning on his cane. "Hope I'm not interrupting," he said, his blue eyes taking in Nate's dejected posture. "Thought I'd check on the progress of my chariot." Nate straightened, forcing a smile. "Perfect timing. Just finished it." He gestured to the wheelchair. "What do you think?" Henry approached slowly, examining the wheelchair with careful attention. He ran his hand over the reinforced frame, tested the new wheels, noted the added features. "This is remarkable, Nate. You didn't just fix it, you transformed it. It'll last you a good long while now," Nate said, genuine pride momentarily displacing his financial worries. "The frame is solid, the wheels roll smooth, and I added that pocket for your cane like I mentioned." Henry lowered himself into the chair, adjusting the footrest that Nate had customized to better fit his height. "Comfortable too. You do excellent work, son." He looked up at Nate, his expression serious. "What do I owe you for all this?" Nate waved a hand. "Nothing. Like I said, it's on the house." "That's not right," Henry protested. "These parts, your time, it must have cost you." "Consider it a friend discount," Nate insisted. Henry studied him for a long moment. "Something's troubling you. Is it the shop?" Nate hesitated. He didn't want to burden Henry with his problems, especially given the old man's recent fall. But there was something about Henry's direct gaze that made it difficult to dissemble. "The bank called," Nate admitted. "I'm behind on loan payments. If I can't come up with the money by the end of the month, I'll lose the shop." Henry nodded slowly, unsurprised. "I suspected things were tight. How much do you need to get caught up?" "It's not just getting caught up," Nate said, the words tumbling out now that he'd started. "Business has been slow for months. The building owner raised the rent last quarter. Equipment keeps breaking down. I've tried everything I can think of, but—" He gestured helplessly. "The numbers just don't add up." "Every business goes through rough patches," Henry said calmly. "What does your long-term plan look like?" Nate laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Long-term? I'm just trying to make it to next week." "That's the problem right there," Henry said, wheeling himself closer to Nate. "You're fighting fires instead of building for the future." "Hard to build for a future that might not exist," Nate countered, a rare edge of bitterness in his voice. Henry wasn't deterred. "Tell me something. If money wasn't an issue, what would you do with this shop? What's your vision?" The question caught Nate off guard. He'd been so focused on survival that he'd stopped dreaming about what the shop could become. I don't know. I guess I'd expand the services. There's a market for repairing high-end electronics that I can't tap into because I don't have the right equipment. I'd hire an assistant so I could take on more jobs. Maybe add a small retail section for parts and tools so people could do simple repairs themselves." As he spoke, enthusiasm crept into his voice. These were dreams he'd put aside, but they'd never fully disappeared. "The community needs this shop," Nate continued. "Just last week, Mrs. Porter from the senior center brought in a lamp her late husband had given her. The wiring was shot, but no one else would fix it because it would have been cheaper to buy a new one. You should have seen her face when I got it working again." He shook his head. "But wanting to help people doesn't pay the bills." "It could," Henry said thoughtfully. "With the right approach." He glanced around the shop, then back at Nate. "I might be able to help you. I have some experience in business, as you know." Nate stiffened. "I don't want charity, Henry. Not charity. Investment." Henry held up a hand to stop Nate's protest. "Hear me out. Every successful business I've been involved with started with a clear vision and a solid plan. Let me help you develop both. If the plan makes sense, I might be interested in becoming a silent partner." "A partner?" Nate repeated, surprised. "In a failing repair shop. In a community fixture with untapped potential," Henry corrected. "Think about it. No need to decide right now." Before Nate could respond, the shop door opened again. This time it was Arlo Jenkins, the building owner, a heavy-set man whose permanent frown had only deepened since he'd inherited the property from his more genial father last year. "Taylor." Arlo nodded tersely, then noticed Henry. "Mr. Winters?" "Mr. Jenkins," Henry replied coolly. Nate was surprised they knew each other. "Need a word with you, Taylor," Arlo said, ignoring Henry now. "In private." "Anything you have to say to me, you can say in front of my friend," Nate replied, a sense of foreboding settling over him. Arlo shrugged. "Suit yourself. I'm here to give you official notice. The building's been sold. New owners want to renovate, turn this whole block into upscale retail. You've got 30 days to vacate." The words hit Nate like a physical blow. "What, you can't do that?" "My lease. Your lease has a clause allowing termination with 30 days' notice in case of sale," Arlo interrupted. Check the fine print. Not my problem anymore anyway. I got a good price from Winter. From who? Nate asked sharply. Arlo shifted uncomfortably. From the development company. Papers will be delivered tomorrow. He turned to leave, then paused. No hard feelings, Taylor. It's just business. After Arlo left, a heavy silence filled the shop. Nate felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath him. Not only was he about to lose the business due to financial troubles, but now he was losing the physical space as well. 30 days. After 3 generations of Taylors operating from this location, it would all be over in 30 days. I'm sorry, Nate, Henry said quietly. This is difficult news. Nate barely heard him. His mind was racing, trying to process what had happened. Did he say Winter? As in related to you? He turned to Henry, a horrible suspicion forming. Henry's expression was grave. Winter's Development is a subsidiary of Winter's International. But I assure you I had no knowledge of this specific acquisition. Your company is the one kicking me out? Nate's voice rose in disbelief. Was this whole thing some kind of joke to you? Pretend to befriend the struggling shop owner while your company buys the building out from under him? Of course not, Henry said firmly. I had nothing to do with this. My son Thomas runs the development division. I'm not involved in day-to-day decisions. But you own the company, Nate shot back. You said so yourself. It's complicated, Henry sighed. Yes, I still own a significant stake, but I've stepped back from operations. Thomas makes most of the decisions now, and we don't always see eye to eye on business matters. Nate paced the shop floor, trying to make sense of it all. So what am I supposed to do now? In 30 days, I lose everything. The shop, my livelihood, my grandfather's legacy. All gone because your son wants to build upscale retail? I can fix this, Henry said, his voice steady. Let me talk to Thomas. The company can find another property for development. Nate stopped pacing and faced Henry. No, I don't want your help. Not anymore. The sense of betrayal was overwhelming, even if Henry hadn't personally been involved in the decision. I thought you were different. I thought you understood what this place means to me. I do understand, Henry insisted. More than you know. Please, Nate, don't shut me out. Let me make this right. Nate turned away, unable to look at Henry any longer. I think you should go. Take your wheelchair. No charge, Henry didn't move. Son, you're angry and you have every right to be. But don't make a decision in anger that you'll regret later. What I regret, Nate said slowly, is ever thinking we could be friends. We're from different worlds, Henry. In yours, a small repair shop is just collateral damage in a business deal. In mine, it's everything. The hurt that flashed across Henry's face almost made Nate take back his words. But the pain of betrayal was too fresh, too deep. After a long moment, Henry nodded. I understand, I'll go. But this isn't over, Nate. I meant what I said about helping you. He wheeled himself to the door, then paused. Thank you for fixing my wheelchair. It means more than you know. After Henry left, Nate locked the door behind him and flipped the sign to closed. Then he sank to the floor, his back against the counter, and buried his face in his hands. 30 days. A lifetime of work, his grandfather's legacy, his own dreams, all coming to an end in 30 days. And the one person he'd begun to trust, to see as a friend and mentor, was connected to the very company taking it all away. The irony was bitter. He'd fixed Henry's wheelchair out of kindness, expecting nothing in return, and now he was losing everything. As night fell outside, Nate remained on the floor of his shop, surrounded by the tools and parts and memories that had defined his life, wondering how it had all gone so wrong so quickly. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur for Nate. During the day, he kept the shop open, serving the few customers who came in, fixing toasters and lamps and coffee makers as if nothing had changed. At night, he packed boxes, carefully wrapping his grandfather's tools and dismantling the workbenches that had been in the shop for decades. He hadn't heard from Henry since their confrontation, though he'd spotted the old man once across the town square, sitting in the wheelchair Nate had repaired, watching children play on the swings. Nate had turned and walked in the opposite direction, ignoring the pang of regret that shot through him. Word had spread around Pine Creek about the impending closure. Longtime customers stopped by to express their dismay, some bringing small gifts, homemade cookies, a bottle of whiskey, handwritten cards thanking Nate for years of service. Their kindness only made the loss more painful. Maggie from the diner had organized a petition to save the shop, gathering hundreds of signatures from town residents opposed to the development. But Nate knew it was futile. The legal paperwork was ironclad. The building had been sold and he had to vacate. On what he believed would be his final Saturday in business, Nate opened the shop at the usual time, not expecting many customers. Most people already knew he was closing and had stopped bringing in items for repair. He'd spent the morning answering the same questions from the few who stopped by. No, he wasn't relocating. No, he didn't have another job lined up. Yes, it was a shame the shop was closing after so many years. By afternoon, the shop was empty. Nate sat at the counter, looking around at the space that was already beginning to feel like a memory. Most of the shelves had been cleared, the walls stripped of the framed photos and newspaper clippings that had documented the shop's history. All that remained were a few boxes of parts and his essential tools, which he'd been using until the very end. The bell over the door jingled, and Nate looked up, prepared to answer the same questions again. Instead, he saw Henry wheeling himself into the shop looking determined. "Before you ask me to leave," Henry said quickly, "please hear me out. 5 minutes, that's all I ask." Nate's first instinct was to refuse, to protect himself from further disappointment. But something in Henry's expression, a mixture of resolve and hope, made him hesitate. 5 minutes, Nate agreed reluctantly. Henry nodded gratefully and wheeled himself to the counter. "First, I want to apologize. Not just for what my company did, but for not being more forthcoming with you from the beginning." "Your apology doesn't change anything," Nate said, his voice flat. "I'm still losing the shop. That's what I came to talk about." Henry reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a manila envelope. "I've spent the past 3 weeks in negotiations with my son and the board of directors." He placed the envelope on the counter. "This is for you." Nate looked at the envelope suspiciously. "What is it?" "Open it," Henry urged. With reluctant fingers, Nate opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of legal documents. He scanned the first page, then looked up at Henry in confusion. "I don't understand." "It's the deed to this building," Henry explained. "Winters Development has agreed to transfer ownership to you, personally. The shop is yours, Nate. Not just the business, but the actual building." Nate stared at Henry, unable to process what he was hearing. "That's not possible. Your son's company bought this entire block for development." "Plans change," Henry said with a small smile. "Let's just say I reminded my son of certain corporate bylaws that give the founder final say in major decisions. It wasn't easy, and it involved some compromises on other properties, but in the end he agreed to exclude this building from the development plan." Nate looked down at the deed again, his hands shaking slightly. "You're giving me the building? Just like that?" "It's not a gift," Henry clarified. "It's a correction of an injustice. This shop has been a part of Pine Creek for generations. It belongs here with you." He paused. "There's more. Keep reading." Nate turned to the next document, which outlined a business proposal. As he read, his eyes widened. "This is a partnership offer," Henry finished for him, "completely separate from the building transfer. Winters Community Investment Fund would like to provide capital for you to expand Taylor's Fix-It shop into what we're calling the Pine Creek Repair and Innovation Center. Teaching classes, providing workspace for young people interested in learning repair skills, offering services to restore and preserve items of sentimental or historical value." Nate couldn't believe what he was reading. It was as if Henry had reached into his mind and pulled out every dream he'd ever had for the shop, ideas he'd barely even articulated to himself, let alone to others. "Why would you do this?" Nate asked, still suspicious. "What's in it for you or your company?" "Several things, actually," Henry replied frankly. "First, it's a sound investment. There's a growing movement toward sustainability. Repair rather than replace. Second, it provides excellent community relations for Winters International, at a time when large corporations are under scrutiny for their environmental and social impacts." He wheeled himself closer to the counter, his voice softening. "But personally, I'm doing this because I believe in you, Nate. Because when you saw an old man struggling with a broken wheelchair, you didn't see a business opportunity or a burden. You saw a person who needed help. That kind of character is rare and worth investing in." Nate set the papers down, overwhelmed. The shop wasn't just being saved. It was being transformed into something greater than he'd ever imagined possible. Yet a lingering doubt remained. How do I know this isn't charity? Or worse, a way to control me? Henry nodded as if he'd expected the question. The partnership agreement is structured as a legitimate business investment. Winter's Community Investment Fund provides capital. You provide expertise in day-to-day management. The fund receives a modest return on successful operations, which it reinvests in other community projects. You retain controlling interest and full operational authority. He gestured to the papers. It's all spelled out in the documents. Have your own lawyer review them. I can't afford a lawyer, Nate admitted. Barbara Chen on Main Street is excellent, Henry suggested. Tell her I sent you. The initial consultation will be my treat. Consider it an apology for the stress of the past few weeks. Nate ran a hand through his hair, trying to process everything. This is a lot to take in. I understand, Henry said. Take your time. Think it over. The offer has no expiration date. He began to wheel himself toward the door. Wait, Nate called. You said this was about investing in me and my character. But the truth is I misjudged you. I accused you of betraying me when you were actually trying to help. Why would you still want to partner with someone who thought the worst of you? Henry turned his wheelchair to face Nate again. Because you were hurt and angry and afraid of losing something precious to you. We all say things we don't mean in such moments. What matters is who you are at your core. And I saw that the day you offered to fix an old man's wheelchair without a second thought. He smiled. Besides, I haven't had this much excitement in years. Arguing with my son, negotiating with the board, it reminded me that I'm not quite ready for the rocking chair yet. Despite himself, Nate smiled too. The thought of Henry, who had seemed so frail when they first met, going toe-to-toe with corporate executives to save a small-town repair shop, was both absurd and somehow perfectly fitting. What does this mean for your simple life here in Pine Creek? Nate asked. If we do this, people will figure out who you really are. Perhaps it's time, Henry acknowledged. Living in anonymity has its advantages, but also its limitations. I've missed being able to make a difference, to use the resources and connections I've built over a lifetime. He adjusted his position in the wheelchair Nate had repaired with such care. This shop, what it could become, feels like the right place to start again. Nate looked around at the half-packed shop, then back at the documents on the counter. Just days ago, he'd been preparing to lose everything. Now he was being offered not just a reprieve, but an opportunity to create something even more meaningful than what he'd had before. If I agree, Nate said slowly, I want one condition. Name it, Henry replied. The community classes, the workspace for young people, they need to be affordable, accessible to everyone. Not just those who can pay. Henry's face broke into a wide smile. I was hoping you'd say something like that. There's a provision for scholarships in the business plan, on page 12. Of course there was. Henry had thought of everything. Nate shook his head in amazement. So, Henry prompted, what do you think? Instead of answering immediately, Nate came around from behind the counter and extended his hand. I think partners should shake on it, before the lawyers get involved. Henry's grip was firm as they shook hands, his blue eyes bright with emotion. Partners, he agreed. The bell over the door jingled again, and they both turned to see a teenage boy enter, clutching a broken remote-controlled car. Are you still open? The boy asked hesitantly. My grandpa said you might be closing, but I really need my car fixed. I saved up my allowance. He held out a handful of crumpled bills. Nate and Henry exchanged a glance, and Nate smiled. We're definitely open, Nate assured the boy. In fact, we're going to be open for a long time to come. He gestured for the boy to bring the car to the counter. Let's take a look at what we've got here. As Nate examined the toy car, explaining to the boy what he was checking and why, Henry watched with satisfaction. This was exactly why he'd fought so hard for this shop. For this young man who represented everything Henry had come to value in his later years: integrity, kindness, and the simple joy of helping others. The late afternoon sun streamed through the shop windows, illuminating the tools of Nate's trade and the hopeful face of the boy waiting for his toy to be repaired. In that moment, surrounded by the past and the promise of the future, Henry felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. Sometimes, he reflected, the most valuable investments weren't found in boardrooms or on balance sheets, but in moments of simple human connection, like when a kind young man offers to repair an old man's wheelchair, not knowing he's a billionaire, and in doing so, sets in motion a chain of events that enriches both their lives in ways neither could have imagined. Outside the shop, Pine Creek carried on with its small-town rhythms, people greeting each other on the sidewalks, children playing in the park, the dinner crowd beginning to gather at Maggie's diner. But inside Taylor's fix-it shop, something new was taking shape, a partnership founded on mutual respect and shared values, and a vision for a future where the simple act of repairing what was broken could build something greater than either man could have created alone. "Hand me that screwdriver, would you?" Nate asked the boy, pointing to a tool on the counter. As the boy eagerly passed it over, his face lighting up at being included in the repair process, Henry knew with certainty that his investment in this shop, in this town, and most importantly, in this young man, would pay dividends far beyond anything that could be measured in dollars and cents. And that, after all, was the true measure of wealth,